My name is Sam Goree, and today I'm presenting our paper. It was really all about books, speech like Techno-Masculinity in the Rhetoric of dot-com-era web design books. This is a talk about the history of web design, particularly how web design developed a professional identity. We investigated how a corpus of popular books shaped the disciplinary identity of web design in the early 2000s. These books use a characteristic rhetorical style, which we call speech-like techno-masculinity, to define web design, its values, its history, and its relationships with other disciplines. We became interested in these web design books and chose the elements of our corpus based on interviews for a different web design history project. We were struck because participants kept mentioning books by a few key authors. For example, one participant said, "Designing Web Usability was a really life-changing book for me." Another said, "The Big Red Fez. It's a great little book and very easy to read." A third said, "Don't Make Me Think is still the single best book on web design." So we went out and read these books. This is what my desk looked like at the time. These are all the books that we read. They were all mentioned in our interviews and span an 11-year range, from 1996 to 2007. These books are a great site to study translational science in HCI. So unlike other disciplines, HCI doesn't really have a one-directional translation from research to practice. Instead, it sort of has this network of researcher practitioners. And the authors of web design books that we studied span this researcher-practitioner spectrum, from established HCI researchers like Jacob Nielsen to working designers and entrepreneurs like David Siegel or Jeffrey Veen. And so design knowledge flows in multiple directions here. These books were written for working designers, but some of them are assigned to HCI students today. Anyway, we were interested in how these books wrote about web design, less about what they had to say. And this led us to a discourse analysis approach based on close reading. So we analyzed passages which either echoed a theme from our interviews, discussed the history of web design, described the purpose of the book or the author's reason for writing, or referenced other books from our corpus or their authors. In general, we found 5 trends across our corpus. First, appeals to personal credibility. From Jeffrey Veen, "My past is one shared by almost everyone with whom I consider a peer. Early video games in elementary school, a Commodore 64 in junior high, and a Macintosh in college." Second, they write in a style peppered with humor and cultural references, like this visual gag about Flash, or this passage from Steve Krug. "On the web, you're usually trying to find something. In the real world, it might be the cheapest forehead VCR with commercial advance, or the name of the actor in Casablanca who played the head waiter at Rick's." This is mimicking a certain conversational style. They have these dramatic, attention-grabbing claims, like digital metaphor is the enemy of progress. And they use history as a tool to predict the future and justify their design advice. For instance, hardware technology is the constraining factor, and we will have to wait until approximately the year 2007 for books to go away and be fully replaced with online information. Legacy publishers, be warned, this will happen. Finally, they define web design in opposition to other disciplines. For example, Jacob Nielsen makes a dichotomy between art and engineering, and takes the engineering side. But on the other hand, Seth Godin makes a dichotomy between engineering and marketing, and takes the marketing side. In general, these books use ellipses, italics for emphasis, and other offhand remarks. For instance, like this section titled "Pornography, the Ultimate Web Content," Vincent Flanders writes, "They might not pay to read Michael Kinsley's Slate magazine, but they might pay to see him naked." Well, maybe that's a bad example. You know what I mean. If that really was a bad example, he wouldn't have put it in the book. So these authors are framing complex differences in simple us versus them terms, and they back their arguments up with toilet humor. And so this is more like a transcription of oral rhetoric from tech conference talks than traditional written rhetoric. And that makes sense, because these books serve as merchandise and advertisements for their authors' talks. These authors would give talks and sell their books, and then they would hope the readers would invite the speakers to talk at their companies and hire them as consultants. We also noticed that the authors write bold claims. They rely on pop culture and justify their expertise through their identities, appealing to their audience of mostly nerdy white men. And so this is typical of dot-com-era Silicon Valley occupational masculinity studied by Rosemary Wright in the 90s. And there's this prevailing theme of revolution, of jocks versus nerds versus cool kids, where tech companies are the revenge of the nerds underdog, rising up against traditional business practices. For example, in this passage by Vincent Flanders, If you want to be accepted as a cool web designer and invited to all the trendy parties, you need to publicly decry usability and its adherents, especially Jacob Nielsen, and talk about community and the need for postmodern, deconstructionist, techno-style blah 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 in web design. However, best practices don't have to be like this. These sorts of resources are really essential for translational HCI. They're well-written books that appeal to a broad audience, and can start a new discipline with good design practices. And so that they're useful, but by justifying their recommendations through the masculine expertise and culture fit of their authors, they can unintentionally exclude people who aren't used to that culture, and inadvertently shape the culture of web design. So, all in all, we have 2 recommendations. First, we should teach these books in cultural context. So when our students approach these books, they should understand why the authors used such exaggerated rhetoric, what they were responding to, and avoid treating these recommendations as web design gospel. Second, we believe we should develop best practices for best practice writing to create better resources for new design disciplines going forward. We can't really go back in time and restart web design and create new versions of these books, but inevitably other design disciplines will emerge in the future, and we shouldn't just publish the most vocal entrepreneurs trying to advertise their services. We should think about whose voices we're amplifying and what sorts of design principles that they're spreading. Thank you, and enjoy Kai.